And that was one of the big preventers for me talking about this for the whole of my life. It wasn't just that I was trying to keep this big secret. It's that I couldn't say it. When I did try to articulate it, it sounded insane to my ears. I'm inside a dark tunnel above my body. And I know I'm in the ambulance, but I can't see the ambulance. I'm in a different dimension close to my body, which I know is in the ambulance. And it looks like a cave to me. And I hear this is so strange for me to talk to your audience about this because there are travel people, but I'm going to just say it.
You'll hear the rest of that story today. I promise. That is Peter Panagore. He's going to share what happened after he died a second time and came back. And yes, he has had 2 near-death experiences. You can hear about the first one in part 1, which I published in the episode prior to this one. And I also discuss, why I decided to kind of put this out there, give you some context and background for near-death experiences, what made me interested in them, some of the skepticism, doubt, and all that type of stuff. So I'm not going to rehash all that here. If you want more context for the following conversation, I highly recommend you listen to part 1 with Peter, which is the episode previous to this in the podcast feed. And I'm excited to bring you part 2 today, where we dive even deeper into questions around death, mysticism, enlightenment, what Peter describes as the union experience, and much more. Let's get into it, shall we? Buckle up, strap in. Thanks for being here, and welcome to the Zero to Travel podcast, my friend.
You're listening to the Zero to Travel podcast, where we explore exciting travel-based work, lifestyle, and business opportunities, helping you to achieve your wildest travel dreams. And now your host, world wanderer and travel junkie, Jason Moore.
Hey, it's Jason here with ZeroToTravel.com. Welcome to the show, my friend. Thanks for hanging out, letting me bring a little travel into your ears today. This is the show to help you travel the world on your terms, to fill your life with as much travel as you desire, no matter what your situation or experience. And in many ways, isn't death the ultimate trip if we go somewhere? There's no trip like it on Earth, that's for sure. And you're going to hear Peter's story today from his second near-death experience. And as I mentioned at the top, if you want more context for this conversation, please, I encourage you to listen to part 1 of this episode. I won't go into it here. If you've already heard it, you understand. But if you haven't, go listen to that first. And we're just going to get right into it. You can check out Peter's work at peterpanagore.love. We'll link up to it. And of course, he has a book, which I read. It's a lovely book. Heaven is Beautiful, How Dying Taught Me That Death is Just the Beginning. And I'll leave you with a quote from that book as we sign off. For now, please enjoy my conversation with Peter, part 2. And what I usually say right here is I'll see you on the other side, my friends. But, in this case, maybe I should just clarify. I will see you on the other side of this interview, or maybe on the other side too. Who knows? Please enjoy my chat with Peter, and I'll see you over there. Cheers. Do you have any rituals before you go into something like this, like a podcast, or before you have one of your no church events on your YouTube channel, which we can talk about? But do you have anything you do before these conversations?
If I have time, I do some physical yoga, some asanas. And if I don't have time, I do a little bit of meditation. This morning I was a little hurried because I got up late. But most of the time I meditate before in one way or another. It's been a habit for decades.
When did you get into yoga?
1980. I stumbled into it. I had traveled in a theater company when I was in college for a semester, but it was a whole year project. And I was traveling. It was an American sign language theater, and I was a mime. And when I got back to my university, it's the year I died. And when I got back to my university the next fall, I took another mime course, pantomime. And my teacher was in the school of Marcel Marceau. He was the student of a student. And Marcel Marceau taught Hatha yoga as part of mime warm-up. And at the same time, I was beginning this yoga practice as part of my curriculum. I read the Yoga Sutras and the autobiography of a yogi. And my teacher, my mime teacher, who's still a friend of mine, he's in his 80s, and we're still in contact. He showed me what's called Kriya or Chi or energy, and he showed the whole class. But I was the only one in the class who could feel this radiant thing that was inside of me that came back with me after I died. And so this combination of things drove me toward a long practice of physical yoga, hatha yoga, with Kriya yoga, which is an interior breath practice found in the Yoga Sutras, in combination. So I've been doing yoga for 40 years. I'm a little slack right now in the asana end of it, but the breath part of it is what drives me and always has. And why, you might ask? Because it opens my interior.
The autobiography of a yogi, I've read that 2 or 3 times. That's one of the life-changing books, I'd have to say. If somebody asked me for a list of the life-changing books that I've read, that would definitely have to be on the list for me.
Oh, good to hear.
You have a Master's of Divinity from Yale, and I'm just wondering, since we're on book knowledge topic, was it strange going from, you've had these actual experiences versus, now you're consuming sort of intellectual knowing rather than, let's say, pure knowing or pure not knowing? I don't know how you would describe it. How is that for you?
Oh, that was a good description, actually. Both of those in combination. I went to study head knowledge because I had no language to formulate a personal understanding of what happened to me. I went in pursuit of other people who might be like me in the history of the world because I didn't know anybody it was alien to me. So I figured that maybe the mystics, mystic writers across the world, but at Yale I studied the Western world. I might find a peer group and language to think about what happened to me. That was my driver. And the head knowledge part of it never matches the experience part of it, not even close. It's the size of a grain of sand compared to the universe and for meaning. But the head knowledge allows me to communicate about it and to think about it for myself, give myself an interior framework. Because on the other side, there was no language. No, I had no brain. There were no conceptualizations of anything, no ideas, no language. So when I came back, I needed to drive myself interiorly. So I did these 2 things. I went inside through my yoga practice, and I went into my head through my scholarship.
That's the best you can do.
It was. And I had no guidance. There was nobody out there helping me out. I was on my own. I was just trying to figure stuff out as I went.
That's the thing to really keep in mind, I think, as we continue to have this discussion, is that this was a different time, right? I mean, you couldn't just, now you can go online and search NDE or near-death experiences, and you can see all these stories and all these people. And I mean, once you started hearing stories from other people, that must have been so validating.
Yeah, and it wasn't so long ago. Maybe 2016, found a community of people.
That's like over 2 decades later, 2.5 decades that you're working through this on your own. Tough. You mentioned last time we chatted that a lot of people that have near-death experiences end up in divorce because of the changes that come about after their return. And I'm just wondering, how did it change the way you relate to other people or even to humanity?
Entirely differently. Oh, that's a good question. I found myself as an alien here. There wasn't and isn't a moment that goes by that I don't have the continual experience of witnessing myself and the world. I never fully came back. Most of me stayed on the other side, and I was aware of this all the time. And I had this inhabiting this physical body. I used to think of my body as a biological robot. I still kind of feel that is a pretty good analogy. And I am an app nowadays. I'm an app inside of this physical robot. And for most of my life, I was like the only one. It's like I was looking around at everybody else, and they had no idea that they weren't from here. They couldn't see the light. I could see light in everything. And so my relationship, especially in the beginning, I loved everybody with this broad sweep of love that was disconcerting to all genders. And I wasn't in pursuit of sexual relationship. I had a girlfriend after I came back. But I was in love with everybody. That was very difficult for her. That I learned to tone that down a little bit. But when I see what people do with violence and hatred and those aspects of human jealousy and vengeance, and they are so far off the mark that I struggle to understand how humanity's ever going to change without some sort of interior change. My relationship to people directly, like to my family, my mom and my dad and my brothers and my sisters, I functioned under a different rule set. As Paul said in the New Testament, he said, in the world, but not of the world. That's exactly how it's been for me.
You know, you mentioned having to tone it down, and that can be a universal struggle for a lot of people, right? Like whatever you've gone through, or I mean, even relating it back to travel and saying, okay, well, you come back from a trip and you no longer feel like you fit in where you came from. You know, you come back and it all seems foreign, like wherever, you know, I'm not comparing your experience to that, but, you know, just trying to kind of a broader conversation here around this concept of trying to tone something down that you feel is your authentic self in a way. That's hard.
I think you made a good analogy, Jason. I think that the analogy of especially radical foreign travel, somewhere where they don't speak your language and have a deep history that is entirely different from your own, when you come back, you realize that your culture is an overlay on humanity. It's not actually who we are. It's a construct. Very good analogy. And that's how I felt when I came back. I didn't fit in anymore. And so I toned it down as best I could, but it was spilling out all over out of me. It's just like pouring out of me and causing all sorts of difficulties. But also it was, even though I kept it a secret, it wasn't invisible to the people around me. I became eccentric in the decision-making process, giving up I was an English major as an undergrad, and I was going to go into architecture, which has been my family plan for me, even though I wasn't 1,000% thrilled every single day of my life about it. But I'd been training for it, and I loved architecture. You know, it was the end. I was going to end up working with my dad, which was, you know, you're working with your dad. It can be great, can not be great. But I loved my dad. And I was going to go to graduate school in architecture and join the family firm. And nobody in my family could understand why I wouldn't do that. Why I went to study, of all things, the most impractical thing there is, mysticism, except for an English degree. So like an English degree is about as practical as a mystical degree. And so my family was pretty concerned for me. And in this youth group, so I had this, I got the dean of students at Yale convinced me to get ordained. That was not my intent, to go into the church. My intent was to get a doctoral degree and a postdoctoral degree and teach at a university. But my dean talked me into ministry. And this first job I got recruited to, I was an associate minister with all these youth in this youth group, some of whom are still in touch with me. And I went back after my second book came out. I went back and I spoke at this church. It was my first speaking event on this book tour, and a bunch of them showed up. And I told the story to this now, 20 years later congregation, and some of the youth came up to me afterwards and said, "Peter, you know, we talked among ourselves. We knew you weren't telling us something, and your behavior was so different from any minister we'd ever met. We knew that you had something else going on. And in fact, I would kick off my shoes in the pulpit. I preached barefoot my entire life as often as I could. I drove the church congregation into serving in the homeless shelter, bringing food and the youth. Whenever there was this violent confrontation, we went apple picking. There was this potential for a violent confrontation when one of the kids crossed some angry man who was carrying a lot of rage inside of him, and I had to jump in between them. This guy was going to pummel this kid. And instead of fighting him, I knelt down in front of him, which totally threw him off. And I asked him to calm down, and he did. And my youth group members like, what was that? So I couldn't really hide it.
Right.
But I didn't talk about it.
You tried, but you could. It was still coming out. It was still obvious. It sounds like that.
Yep, to everybody.
Well, I mean, your authentic self is going to sneak out even if you try to repress it, I suppose. So why repress it, right? I mean, do you feel like now at this point, is it more freeing now that you can just openly talk about this stuff and put content out there around it? It must feel good.
Yeah, it's freeing. The entire time I was in the church, I masked. I couldn't talk about any of the aspects of it. I didn't talk about it at all. I pretended that I was a believing Christian and I did good work in the church. Let me just say that I used a lot of people's wealthy money in order to help the people who had none regularly. This is what the congregations I served ended up doing. But I never talked about it. And so I always lived masked, and I pretended that I was a believer. There's a difference between belief and knowledge, just letting your folks know. And nowadays, I'm completely open about it. And sometimes it's a little nervy from some of the things I say. I know my family doesn't know what I talk about, my mom and my brothers and sisters, and I wonder if someday they listen in, what they would think about what I have to say. Not so much.
You think they still don't know? Really?
No, they know that I died. They know that I died and came back. But my son has read my book. My wife and my daughter, of course, know my story because they've heard it. And I've told it to my brother and sister, my mom, and my dad before he passed. But they don't know the depth of it. I kind of washed it over a little bit with them because, well, it's hard for people to think such things about you if they don't really believe in the other side themselves. And I'm not a believer, but if you haven't had an experience and you're not a believer so much, then it becomes very difficult to hear what I have to say.
I read this question somewhere. I thought it was a good one for you, having seen so many sides of this. Do non-religious ethics work as a foundation for morality?
Do non-religious ethics work as a foundation for morality?
As in, do we need these religious frameworks do we need these religious frameworks in order to have a moral society, essentially?
I wonder about that question myself, because as I'm not a big fan of religion. Let me just say that in the beginning here. But religion has created lots of destruction worldwide, and it's not just in Christianity. You look anywhere in the history of the world, and you see the same human behavior, because religions become the projection of the self. And the self essentially is self-interested, and that self-interest creates a power dynamic. And if you don't believe as I do, I'm going to kill you. So there's that. But on the other hand, an ethical morality based in religion has actually helped society. And it's hurt it as well, but it's also kept some constraints. But those constraints are being lifted now, especially in the West. And when I say that, I mean Europe's ahead of the United States and Canada, but the United States and Canada are fast catching up to the secularization of society. And as a result of that, in the United States, at least, there's a rise in violence. And so when the threat of hell is removed, then people aren't afraid to do whatever. And I'm not saying hell is as it is in the Bible, because it isn't. But that provided some constraints, some guardrails on the bowling alley. I'm going to keep going here for a second, Jason, and say that when I died, all of my morality went away. My whole system of self-understanding and religion and politics, and like you traveling in a foreign country, like, well, that's different than I was told. And so my framework vanished, including morality. And what I found is over the decades of practice, and I came back with initially, was the more a person falls into the light and surrenders oneself, the more moral one becomes. And it's not moral like a goody two shoes. It's moral like you see the other person as yourself. You see the light, and I see the light inside people, and I see their brokenness. I know myself as a flawed person, that I am a speck, a tiny grain of sand in the universe of time and space. I'm as equal to another grain of sand in comparison as any other grain of sand. And so that from that framework, the interior projection of the light inside of me and into my life, morality arises. It's a different sort of thing. And I think the cultural overlay of morality based in the ethics of religion has had a positive impact. But what do you do when it's gone?
Is there a hell? You mentioned that really quickly when we were.
I went to a hell. Not everybody does. There's a lot of near-death experiencers out there, and only a few of us pass through what I termed as a hell. It's a construct of language because I didn't know what else to call it. I called it that in the book, but later on I changed it to the purgative fires of divine love. I went through my life review, was suffering all of the pain that I gave away from the interior perspective of every single person that I caused pain to in my entire life, in sequence, simultaneous to experiencing my own reasons for causing that pain. And the juxtaposition of these two perspectives helped me understand my own smallness, and the pain that I gave away in life actually was accrued to me. But I wasn't being judged. I judged myself in comparison to this infinite love, mercy, joy, beauty that was infilling and surrounding me. And my attention was on myself as I was being seen. All of the dark places in myself were illuminated. There was nowhere to hide any of the things that I had done. But once I turned my inner self to listening to the love that was being given to me, then all of that just went away. Like in a Star Trek episode when they shoot a phaser at something and the object dissolves into molecules. It doesn't exist anymore. And that's all of the suffering that I had caused, and all of my separation from the divine, infinite, ineffable, also dissolved. And from that moment on, I was infilled and enfolded inside this unitive state of joy, beauty, sweetness, paradise, understanding, knowledge. I understood that my human life was never me. I understood that I am, as it says in Genesis, an image in the image of the divine. I am a reflection. I'm a singular photon from a field of photons, super connected, entangled with them. So I prevented myself from connecting in life every time I caused harm. And so as a human being, I cause harm to people. I mean, ever since then, I know I've hurt people. Hurt the people you love. That's the way it is. And so every time I do that, I recognize that I've put another grain of sand in my bag of separation. And so I do my best to take that grain of sand out, not because I'm afraid of going back through the same fiery sword, because I'm not. I just don't want it. I want it to be a shorter duration. That's all. But most NDEers, they don't have an experience of any kind of hell. It's a few of us who do. Why? Is it contextualized by my religious upbringing? I was raised Roman Catholic and Greek Orthodox. Maybe there's something to that. And it was approaching me in a symbolic way that I could comprehend. I don't really know the answer to that question.
What happened the second time? Because I don't know that story. And I don't know that a lot of NDEers have experienced this twice. Would you mind telling that story?
Not at all, Jason. This 20 years later, more than 25 years later, oh my gosh, 2015. I'll tell a shortened version of it. I ran 5K the day before, trail running, back when I could do that. And I was going to go, I'll tell this part of it. I was going to go sailing. Someone had loaned me a sailboat on an extended loan for years. So I had this small sailboat that I had use of. And I went down to go sailing in the morning because I live in the ocean, and it was so fogged in I couldn't even see the boats in the morning. And I was like, oh, what am I going to do? I only have a couple of hours. So I decided, I'm going to go to yoga class. So there was a yoga teacher in town with a little studio, summertime, and I went to the studio and I got there late. And so the place was packed, and she's a friend of mine. So she let me set up my mat actually in the door jamb. Like I opened the door wide, and half of my mat was in the studio and half of my mat was in the hallway. And it was summer, as I said, so it was hot, and I began the practice, and I got to downward dog, and I started sweating profusely. I thought, is it because this is like hot yoga today? And I just started sweating more and more. And I thought to myself, okay, think about this. It's not that hot in here. Why am I sweating? I thought, all right, I'm going to lay down on my back. So I lay down on my back in what's called Shavasana, and I'm just lying there resting, trying to figure out what's going on. Why am I sweating so much as the class continued? And I started feeling pain in my heart. It's like, this is weird. What's that? And it got worse and worse and worse. And my sweating got worse and worse and worse. And I thought, I'm having a heart attack. But I can't really have a heart attack. I'm super fit and I eat well. I thought, I'm going to get out of here. So I just got up off my mat and I went outside and I sat in an Adirondack chair for a minute. And I thought, oh my gosh, this is getting worse. So I lay down in the shadow, in the fresh mown dew covered grass, kind of cool myself down. And it got worse and worse. And I thought, I am having a heart attack. I had been a licensed ambulance attendant at a period in my life. So I self-diagnosed. And so I'm lying there and I'm thinking, I should die today. And I thought, oh my God, because I started thinking about my dad who had a heart attack, my sister who had died of a heart attack, my grandfather who had died of a heart attack. And I thought, oh my God, today's my day. I get to go home today. I've been waiting for this day since I died ice climbing. Today's my day. Who knew? And so I was feeling pretty actually joyous about the whole situation. And then I started thinking about my daughter and my brand new granddaughter and her marriage, which had gone belly up. The poor fellow went off to Afghanistan and he came back with moral injury and things went sour in a bad way. And my son, and I thought, I should probably try to stick around here. She's going to need me. And so I tried to sit up and I couldn't sit up because the pain was too intense. So I lay down and then the teacher came out. Now it's like 20 minutes later and she's, Peter, what's going on? I said, having a heart attack. So I get to long story short, I get to the urgent care center. One of the people drive me over. They diagnosed me with 100% blockage in my widowmaker. So 6% of people survive this statistically. And the doc, and I live an hour and a half from the catheterization lab. And I know everybody in the room. I know all the nurses. I know the doc. I live in a small town. And I could see the serious concern in the faces of the nurses, like, this is bad. And so the doc says, got to get you to the catheterization lab. They call the ambulance. My wife shows up. My son shows up because they're living in town. And they shoot me up with a decoagulant. He said, it might give you a 3% trickle through. And do you want morphine? And I said, no, I can't take morphine. It makes me sick. I'll be vomiting in the back of the ambulance, and I'll be, having a heart attack. Not a good scene. He said, well, what are you going to do? I said, well, I'm going to meditate. He said, what, are you going to meditate? I said, yeah, doing that now. By one of the easy techniques of meditation is to bring your mind and your breath to the thing that hurts in your body. Just focus. You got a bad back, bring your mind to the small of your back and breathe your mind right into that spot. And it doesn't stop the nerve endings from sparking, but it prevents you from feeling it. It kind of raises a person up above it. So you get to witness the pain. And as long as you're in that state of mental focus with breath on the pain doesn't really hurt as much. And anybody, you should try it. It works. It's easy to practice, and it works simply. It works quickly, I should say. So he's like, okay, says the doc. And they load me on the gurney, and my son grabs my hand, and he leans in close, looks me in the eyes and says, I love you, Dad. And one of the after effects of my first NDE is that I see into people. And I read him, plus I know him, really deeply. And I read into him, he's not ready for this. I read all these emotions as they ran by in a mix through his eyes. And I squeezed my wife's hand, and I looked up at her, and I winked, and off I went. And I'm in the ambulance. I get the mask on, and I'm meditating, and it's, like I said, an hour and a half drive. It's a Saturday. I live in Maine, and Maine its motto is the vacation state. So there was a lot of traffic once we got onto, even in my little town, there's a lot of traffic. So the whole thing was taking a long time to get there. The ambulance and the siren and the lights, and I'm meditating, and I'm just meditating, and I suddenly hear the paramedic call into the catheterization lab, and she says, we're losing him. And I open my eyes, and I look up at her, and she has panic on her face. And as soon as she sees my eyes open, she drops into her professional face, which is the right thing for her to do. But as soon as I look at her face, I like, oh my gosh, yes, they're losing me. And then the pain came back because I wasn't meditating. The pain kept getting worse and worse. It was like having an elephant here's a yoga analogy, like having Ganesh standing in tree pose on my heart. So I had an elephant's amount of pain crushing me. And so I dove back inside of my pain because it came rushing back very quickly. And I was like, oh, got to go back in. So I close my eyes and I go back in. And when I go back in, I'm not in my body anymore. I'm inside a dark tunnel above my body. And I know I'm in the ambulance, but I can't see the ambulance. I'm in a different dimension close to my body, which I know is in the ambulance. And it looks like a cave to me. And I hear this is so strange for me to talk to your audience about this because there are travel people, but I'm going to just say it. This angelic being, which was intelligence and love and light, and not at all with wings and a fiery sword. It was a consciousness of the divine itself that was a million times greater than me, came down this shaft, which got wider and wider as it ascended up. And it came down to me and it started calling to me, come home, come home, come home. We want you to come home. It's your time. We've been waiting for you. And it's this plural. It's speaking to me, and it's not in language because I don't have a brain anymore. It's speaking directly to me, and come home. And it's all full of joy. We need you. We've been waiting for you. And I think to myself, I am out of here. I've been praying for my death daily for every single day since the day I died. And finally, I get to go home. And so I start to go. It comes to me, and this time it doesn't envelop me. It's next to me, and kind of like if I had a hand and which I didn't, but we were as if we were holding hands and kind of merrily skipping out in the daisies. We just start to ascend, and I am very, very small. I see myself in comparison to it. It's much larger than I am. I'm this little tiny being of light, and we start to go. And then I think to myself as we begin to depart, because now this time I'm not confused. The first time I didn't understand what was going on. This time I totally know what's happening. And I think to myself, well, wait a second, this is rather sudden. I need to take a look around and make sure my family's okay. So that, because I could see that my son's face, he was not okay. So I without asking more, I just kind of told, I'm turning around, taking a look back inside again before we leave. Okay. And so like, I got to go check the stove, make sure it's off. So I turn around and I go back inside this cave. And in this cave, this darkness of my interior human self, I see my son, and I reread all of the emotions that were there and the way that he said, I love you, Dad. And then I see my daughter, and I realized that there was violence, and there was other bad things that happened, and that I needed to be there to protect her. And then I saw my granddaughter, who was less than a year old. And the same thing happened to me when I saw my parents in the first NDE. I saw my granddaughter's parallel lives. I saw her life with me and her life without me. And the life with me was so much better than the life without me. And I recognized that I needed to be I was her granddad, but I needed to be the dad in her life until maybe another dad came along for her. And even then, I'm still, so I was like, oh my God, she really needs me. And so I turned around and I went back out, and the angelic being, this intelligence, receded, didn't go away, but receded and sort of, politely turned its back and gave me space. And as I went back out again, it came back toward me saying, come on, we're going. It's time for you to come home to us. We've been waiting for you. And I said to it, and telepathically without language, if it's all the same to you, I'm staying, because I know I've been praying for my death for the whole of my life since the day that I died the first time. I've been waiting to go home. And now I recognized that I should stay as long as I could, because I was still needed by my family. And so I had this choice again. And I said, if it's all the same to you, I'm sticking around. And because I understand timelessness, the eternal nature of my own essence, being in time it's a burden, but it's only the wink of an eye. So from the other perspective, so I turned around and I went back in and got to the catheterization lab, and I'm getting wheeled down the corridor, and the doc is there with his retinue, all the people who are going to work with him. And he's looking at my chart, and he says, this man doesn't have morphine. And I said, I don't want morphine. He said, you're awake. I said, yeah, I'm awake. He said, how are you dealing with the pain? I said, I'm meditating. He said, oh, that's interesting. And then we get into the operating room, and he said, we really need to give you morphine. We're going to perform some surgery on you. And I said, well, he's going to stick a thing up my arm. He's not going to be cutting me open. And I said, well, do I need the painkiller? He said, no. I said, well, then don't give it to me. It's going to make me sick. So they did this arthroscopic surgery on me. And then I was in the ICU for many, many hours, and using my brain. I should back up and say here that every heart patient has what's called the golden hour. You have 1 hour to get care before the heart starts to, I want to say corrode, but the cells start to die. And if you survive, you're left with scarring. And so by the time I left the urgent care center in my town, I was already well past my golden hour. And then I had another hour and a half drive. So by the time I got to the cath lab, I had a lot of damage in my heart. And so my pain continued. A lot of people who have a widowmaker heart attack and they get to the cath lab fast enough, it's pretty quick. Their pain kind of goes away. They don't have so much trouble, but I had a lot of trouble. And so I kept refusing morphine and kept meditating. And it was like, I don't know, 15 hours, 14 hours of mental focus, concentration to keep the pain away. And finally, I was just exhausted. And I said to the nurse, to my wife, who was with me, my son was there too. I said, I just can't. I said to my wife, I said, I got to have something. There's got to be something other than morphine. And so she asked the nurse, and the nurse says, oh yeah, we got something else. It's like, okay, give me that. So they gave me whatever it was, and it didn't make me sick. If I had only known, and so I fell asleep, and I woke up the next morning, and they put me in a regular room, and in this room, I had a single, and my family was there, and I had a bunch of friends. I worked in a TV station at this time in my life, and I drove this route, this hour and a half, every week to go to record my show, and so I had a lot of friends in Portland, which is where this TV station was, and plus I knew a bunch of doctors because of the work I'd done before, and so I had this crowd in my room, and the first thing I said to them was, "Hey, I died yesterday." And most of them knew this about me already. And I said, I'm a different person again. And I chose to stay. And my son says to me, Dad, when I said I love you, the doc had told me to say my last goodbyes to you because you were going to die on the way. And that's what I saw in his face. And so it's a little more backstory. I'd been working in New York for this production company, national organization, and they found out about, I had too many drinks one night with them around a big table, and I told them the story, and they talked me into writing the book and produced my book trailer. And so all of that was going on before I got to the hospital. But when I was in the hospital, I got a call from my publisher saying that Amazon was releasing my book a month early on that day. And that when I came back this time, I came back more fully integrated than I'd ever been before. And so I spent several days in the hospital. And while the second big call I got was from the vice president of the television station where I was working in a nonprofit sistered to a corporation, and this sistering had been in place since 1926 when the station began broadcasting on AM radio. And I had a 2-minute spot every single day before the weather to tell an inspirational story to 80,000 people a day. And the corporation had sold this TV station along with 38 other TV stations to a new corporation. And the new corporation found out that I was on the air and told them that they wanted me off the air. And so the VP of the station, who's a really great guy, loved working with these people. This was one of the best jobs I've ever had in my life because of the people in this TV station. They just, I can't say enough good words about it. Anyway, the VP called me and said, Peter, the station's been sold. We have to cancel your show. And I said, well, how much time do I have, Mike? He said, what do you need? I said, well, how about a year or a year and a half? He said, I think we can do a year and a half. We do this real soft closing, but you have to not tell anyone. You have to keep this an utter secret because it'll damage their reputation, because the show I had was an icon. And I said, of course. And so I had this heart attack. My book came out. I went on this book tour. I kept this secret. My TV show eventually got canceled. And then I didn't know what I was going to do with my life. And so I started looking for churches, because I basically only have one set of skills. Ministry is a jack of all trades, but there are very few applications for the broad skill set. So I started looking for jobs in advertising, because I'm a well-published writer. I've published 150 sermons in the leading journal for clergy in the U.S. and I have short stories published. So I have writing skills and I have creativity. So I started looking in advertising firms. And nobody would touch me because I had this word reverend in front of my name. So then I was like, oh my God, what am I going to do? I need a job. So I started looking at churches, and I got this gig in where Swami Vivekananda came to the United States for the Chicago World's Fair. He stopped at one place to give a speech, and it was in this little tiny church north of Boston in this town called Gloucester, or Gloucester, as we say. And they liked me, and it was an independent place, and they called me as their minister, and I accepted. And then I told them I had a movie contract, and they withdrew. And that happened a couple more times, and I was like, okay, so I can't give up this mass marketing approach to try to participate in this global phenomena of near-death experience with 10 to 20 million in the United States alone, let alone the rest of the world, to try to bring into the public square more of a conversation. As you mentioned earlier, when I first began this, nobody talked about it. Now I have this opportunity to have a larger stage for the subject. I can't give that up. And so then I couldn't get a job. And so I didn't know what to do. And then 3 years ago on Easter, Western Easter, not Orthodox Easter, I say that because both of them had significance in my life. I decided to start this channel talking about mysticism, but using to deconstruct the biblical narratives through the eye of my near-death experience. And I went to Catholic high school, read a gospel a year. And when I came back from my NDE, Jesus was not the same guy. When I was reading the Bible, I was like, oh my God, he's like me. He sounds like a near-death experiencer. What he talks about is how I'm living. Make your eye single and your body will be filled with light. That's what was happening to me. And so I decided to go out on my own and do this thing that I'd been thinking about for decades, which was to approach the scriptures through the lens of NDE and use what are called non-canonical texts like the Gospel of Thomas, dug up in 1945, and the Peshitta, which is an Aramaic version of the Gospels that was cast out of the church, out of the Western church, 1,700 years ago, let me think about this, maybe 1,600 years ago. My date's a little bit off. To try to reclaim Jesus as a wisdom, oneness, union teacher, and to strip away his church imposed deification. Because and I'm doing this not because I need to. I'm doing this to make a living, but also because nobody else is doing it. And so what I'm trying to show on my channel is that he's not the guy they taught you about. He's deeper than that. It's more than that. He's much more like the Buddha, or there is reflections in the Upanishads and reflections in the Tao Te Ching and reflections in Rumi and Hafez, these poets, these Sufi poets. I'm trying to rehabilitate Jesus so that people, as they exit Christianity, because religion, to get back to morality and ethics, religion, people can see through the hate. They can see through the hypocrisy. They can see through the greed and the power. But they don't want to give up their spirituality, and they have this framework. This is why I went into the church in the first place. There was a cultural context that I could work within to try to help people find this thing inside them. And now folks are exiting in huge numbers in the West. And now I have this opportunity to help them take a little bit of the stories that they know in order to discover the thing inside them. That's a long-winded answer to your question, what happened to me after my second NDE, but I came back a different person again.
We can mention your YouTube channel here, Not Church. Actually, the description is, welcome to Not Church. Mysticism, no dogma, no doctrine, no Bravo Sierra, mystical community. Science is real, source is real. So, yeah, it's a lot of like everything you just mentioned. And it's another incredible story, no doubt. And you tell it so incredibly. So thank you for sharing. You mentioned between the first one and that one, kind of like always praying to go home for your death. And then it was finally there. And then you came back again. But when your family hears you say that, would that upset them? Like, well, don't leave us, don't pray to leave us, Peter. Come on. We want you here, man.
They didn't know.
No.
I kept it a secret.
Yeah.
And so I came out to my community, my church, and my family. My wife knew, but my kids didn't know. My kids they're in their 30s now, late 20s, early 30s, both of them. And when they were in junior high and high school, I came out to my congregation because there was a big, huge embezzlement. And it's a long story, but it culminated with me having enough trust in my congregation and my community to be able to finally tell the truth. And so I did. And when my kids found that out, I began to talk at the kitchen table over dinner about wanting to go home. And what they and their young minds, and I understand why they thought this, was that Dad doesn't love us enough to stay. And that was a very difficult period in our family life, because that was an internalization of rejection. And I didn't reject them, but I understand that that's what they heard. And so there was a very long time of difficulty. We're all good now. But when I talk about this, like I was just talking to my wife the other day about our granddaughter and how does anyone see a parallel timeline if they've never seen it? So I saw parallel timelines for my mom and my dad without me and with me, and for the same with my granddaughter. I saw what her life was, and she's never going to know that life. Never, not a single bit of it. And neither will anybody else. So to talk about that, it's as if here's the typical example. Describe the color of orange to a person who has never seen. Can't really be done. And that was one of the big preventers from me talking about this for the whole of my life. It wasn't just that I was trying to keep this big secret. It's that I couldn't say it. And when I did try to articulate it, it sounded insane to my ears in the context of our society.
I mean, you put in the work to figure out how to talk about it. Studying, like you said, the book knowledge, put in the work to get a framework for yourself to talk about it. Why is talking about death in the West sort of frowned upon, let's say, generally speaking?
Fear of the unknown. Yeah. We like to pretend it doesn't exist.
It's easier that way sometimes, isn't it?
Yeah, but I also think it has to do with the hell concept. I think people are afraid. The church so boxed in people that it provided this moral framework and this fear of judgment. And even when that was decoupled from religion and I guess humanistic society, secular society, that's the word I'm looking for. The context of that culture carried over. This is my assessment. I was in Ecuador once, and went to Quito, Ecuador, and I went to the street of the coffin makers. And on this street, there were stacks of coffins from large to small in front of 36 shops. And people were bustling about, and I watched these kids with a rubber ball playing a game, bouncing the ball off the stack of caskets. And I was like, oh my God, these people, this culture, death is right in their midst. The kids are playing ball on the caskets, it's an entirely different, this is after my NDE, it's an entirely different concept of what it is to accept life and death. And like you said, it's easier for a lot of people to pretend it doesn't exist. And then when it does come, it's devastating. It's devastating partly because people don't recognize the inevitability of it.
What would you say is enlightenment? Is that something we can attain here? Or maybe we could say awakening, if that's on par or to a lesser extent? What do those things mean to you?
I would say it's quality and quantity, that the quality of the presence is the same in everything, especially in when one begins to awaken to it. But the quantity varies in experience. The inside of everything that is, the quantity and quality is the same. But inside of an individual consciousness, there are variations. The quality is the same, but the awakenedness is different. And there are levels to it. And I know that sounds, to some ears, might be a little grating, but the deeper the level of it, the more humility there is in relationship to it, the less one raises oneself above others. So there's this inverse proportion that one encounters in actual enlightened people. And this is all through the literature too. It's in the mystical literature in the West that one of the major after effects of what the Western mystics call the union experience, the state of union, is humility. And enlightenment doesn't make for a perfect person. It makes for a person who is less burdened by the suffering. Enlightenment isn't it doesn't make a person always behave morally. So here's an example. I did this talk this week for a bunch of Christian clergy for the International Association for Near-Death Studies. And this woman asked me, a clergy person, she said, you talk about Jesus in the Bible being like a near-death experience, or can you give me an example? And I opened up the Gospel of Mark, and I got to this they're called the difficult sayings of Jesus. And in this particular passage, he's walking along, and this woman comes up to him, and she's from a different culture, from like an enemy culture, an enemy nation. And she says to him, "Can you heal my kid?" And Jesus says, "I'm not healing your kid. You're part of the enemy nation. You're nothing to me." And which is a very not enlightened thing to say. You would think that if he was actually enlightened, he wouldn't have his egoic self interfering with his behavior. Now, would he? And she calls him out, and she says, "Hey, even the dogs eat the scraps from the table." So she puts herself down, and he wakes up and he's like, "Oh yeah, sorry, I was speaking from my lower self." So enlightenment isn't this perfect cure-all for human nature. It is this continual connection to the interior divine that is living within us and is all life. And so, yeah, people get enlightened. Awakening can be anything from recognizing a lot of people talk about the synchronicity of angelic numbers. And so they see 111 or 222 or 444 or something like that. And they're like, "Oh, this is a synchronicity," and that's part of awakening. It's a small end of it. And then other people have after death communication. 60% of people who are grieving have some kind of visitation from their deceased loved one. And that's a kind of awakening because it changes their grief moving forward. There are variations to this and levels to it. But enlightenment, called realization or liberation in other cultures, or samadhi or nirvana or heaven or paradise in its fullness, this is of a different order of realization. And in that level of realization, one understands the temporality of existence. And so it's possible to include most NDEers in enlightenment if one of the measures of it is a recognition that consciousness doesn't arise in the human body, but arises outside the body and inhabits the body. But even in that level, there are variations, just as we saw with Jesus, who people acclaim as the best of the best. Even he didn't have a full connection here. So there's always a filter here. That's the thing. The presence of the light on the other side, there is no filter. Well, it's a different kind of filter. It's a lot thinner. Down here, it's a lot denser. And that denseness, in Islam, they call it the 70,000 veils. And beneath the 70,000 veils, there's a lot of layers to lift to approach the 30,000 through which the light pours more readily. So lots of levels to this. But yeah, there are enlightened people.
The varying experiences from NDEers, near-death experiencers, there are some commonalities, and I can link up to some of the books if you want to do further reading, and of course your work and everything. But the experiences, of course, vary within some of those commonalities, and then sometimes they totally veer away from those commonalities. Do you think that, again, I know you don't know the answers, you don't have the answers to these questions, but what's your intuition tell you? Are the variations that you are describing perhaps responsible for the varying experiences of near-death or experiencers? Or is it, some combination of something else? What is your thought around the varying experiences?
I have thought a lot about it. I don't have all the answers, that's for sure. I think that first, the divine is compassion itself and gives each one of us what we need for our understanding, because all the people all the near-death experiences are here, and all the people who've gone there and come back are living lives, and the divine compassion provides for each of us what we need as we move forward in this life. I also think that there are, and this is the thought, I didn't know, that given the great variety of NDEs, there's a lot of heavens out there. It's not a singular thing. As the deeper one goes into the multiverse of heavens, the closer one approaches the divine, the fewer there are, till one reaches back into the oneness. One is enfolded, and no more. There is no more self except for the oneness itself, and so there's that. There's that, and I wish, this is what I do wish. I wish that every NDEer who comes back doesn't make the mistake that they understand the totality of the divine, and that their experience is definitive of all experience. And that's where I think the mistake is actually being made. The thing that's true about mystical writing around the world, in the East and the West, and I could cite a whole bunch of writers and books, that not one of them comes back with the capacity for articulating their experience, because no language can capture it, because there is no language on that side, on the other side. And so just the mere re-entry into a body and a brain in a cultural context, a linguistic context, conceptualizations of life, as we were talking about earlier, say East Asian culture versus British culture, the very different language, which creates a very different mindset. So then the experience gets filtered through that into the person, into the world. And so there's that level of it, which is why every mystic in the history of the world speaks in symbol, metaphor, myth, simile, allegory. So that's, and I do think that I do want to say this though, if you don't mind, that there was a study done. Some of your viewers, some of your listeners might know of the Skinwalker Ranch in the United States. It's a famous ranch for paranormal things. And this billionaire, this Nevada billionaire who owned it, his wife died. And he sold it. And he took all the money from the sale of this and he started the Bigelow Institute for Consciousness Study. And 2 years ago, he offered $1 million prize for scientific research. And the top prize was $500,000, and it was won by somebody. And in the paper that this person produced, and Lovejoy, I think is his name, he did a broad study of near-death experiencers, and he found in his study that 70% of near-death experiencers used 2 words in particular, and those 2 words are love and light. And so even though there's this great diversity through all of our experiences, individuated, subjective experiences, the unifying factor through at least 70% of them are these 2 words, love and light. And neither of those words accurately describe what we experienced, but they're the best 2 we have.
Is your sense that free will is real or some type of illusion?
Well, because as you mentioned in Not Church, science is real. I have a science head. I read science all the time. And I read an article pretty recently in the past year about the biological determinatives are suggesting that free will isn't as free as people might think it is.
Yeah, I think I read that same
So
article.
there's that level of, yeah, it's pretty interesting, isn't it? So yes and no. I definitely have no free will around my dyslexia. I have no free will around my and the ramifications that run out from that my whole life. I have no free will around my need for speed. I'm an athlete, and all my life I love speed. And I get into the zone when I'm in speed, and I didn't choose that. That's just really good for me. But on the other hand, when I was sent back, when I chose to come back and was therefore sent back, kicked out of heaven the first time, as I had to choose a particular life. I was presented with 1 million different lives, and I couldn't see beyond the doors. And the voice that was carrying me back said to me, choose. And I made this quick calculation of what I wanted my life to be. And I went through this door, and as I projected down this tunnel to my body, there were all these doors inside the tunnel, and all the doors inside the tunnel led to all the doors inside all the other tunnels. And when I began to be alive again, and for the whole of my life, I have this distinct, regular experience of every choice that I make changes my direction from tunnel to tunnel. And so I do have this ability to make decisions and aim my life, particularly in terms of relationships. But sometimes I make a good choice and sometimes I make a bad choice. And so I do have the capacity to choose love over selfishness. And the more I choose love over selfishness, the closer I aim myself to the center of all of these doors, to the light that was in the middle of them all. And so although I have no complete control over my free will, I definitely have some. And one of the after effects, people say, oh, that was meant to be. Oh, I was meant to be here. And my experience of that is a little different than what they mean, because I live in this, as a result of my first NDE, time is really shifty for me. And this is one of the things I would not talk about, because this is, he must be crazy kind of thing. But I don't feel very well set in time. And I see the choices I make moments before I make them. I make them as I see them, but I see that I've already had probability. My all of these tunnels and the tunnel that the journey back, the tunnel I took back to my body, and all the other tunnels that I could have chosen were a mass of 1,000,000,000 billion septillion choices of probability. And there were narrow streams of probability. The tunnel that I entered into had say 1,000,000 doors in it. And those were all probable decisions that I would make. And so as I make each individual choice, I'm still in the realm of probability until I make that choice. It's sort of like the double slit experiment where you send the right. So I'm kind of a double split. And so when I see the choices that I'm making, my talk with you this morning, Jason, this is like constant deja vu I live inside of, with bigger crests of waves of intensity, but the waveforms never go away. So sometimes they're tall waves and sometimes they're squishy waves. So meant to be? Yes, absolutely. Because I made a bazillion choices before, and so did all the people around me. But meant to be like it's a blueprint where you have to follow every single number or measurement and line that's drawn on the blueprint by the great architect in the sky. No.
Well, if we're all made of light, then we're all just in a double slit experiment, I suppose, in some ways, right? Who knows? This is going to sound like a robotic question because I'm going to ask about carbon-based life forms. But did you get the sense that this unity you were going towards when you crossed over to the other side, was it made up of more than just the consciousness of human life forms? Because we all know this is an infinite universe, and I mean, personally, I find it hard to believe that we're the only carbon-based life form in the entire universe. That sounds very self-centered. Or if it's a multiverse, then you can extrapolate that to an infinite number of possibilities. But yeah, have you thought about this, spoken on it? Love your thoughts.
Very much. Yeah. I think one of it's the height of religious arrogance. It's the height of religious arrogance to construct a mythology that claims we are the pinnacle and then gives us the power to destroy everything else. That's Genesis. The perspective of Genesis is that humanity is the apple of God's eye, and that we have a dispensation and power to destroy anything we want because we're the best there is. And look what we've done. So that's when I came back, I was like, I see the same light in the chickadee and the sparrow that I see in the human being. There's no differentiation for that. This is the exact same. And here's why I think that we are not the only ones, which is just ridiculous to me. So before I died in 1977, I was a camp counselor in Ohio for the summer at a Catholic kids camp. I was the rifle instructor, and I got permission to take the camp car and go roller skating with a bunch of guys that I had just met from all over the United States who were counselors. And of course, we did that the first week, but the second week I got the car, we bought a bunch of beer and had some cannabis, and we went to go get smashed. And so we took the car not far from the camp and we parked it, and up on this hilltop. And Ohio is flat most of Ohio is flat like a computer screen. But there was this hill on this river, and we're parked there, and I put on the cassette tape, and I was going to light up the pipe, and the guy cracked the beer behind me, and suddenly the entire parking lot was illuminated, and there was a UFO over us. And I can tell you the whole story, but we chased it. The thing was like a 1/4 mile wide, and we chased it. We tossed all the paraphernalia and illegal substances out the window, and we chased this thing for miles and miles. And at about 90 miles an hour, first of all, it was perfectly still and made no noise. And it was twice the height over the trees from us. It was super close to us. And we chased it, and it made a right angle turn at about 90 miles an hour. And then it waited for us to catch up, and then it streaked out of the atmosphere so fast that it left a light trail behind it. And so from that day on, I was like, okay, we are not alone. So thank God that it's in the public domain now in the news that militaries are recognizing the reality that even if religion won't, that we are not alone in the universe. And what I'm hoping will happen is that religion will, especially Western literalism, will come crashing down when its primary mythology is utterly proven wrong. And then what will be left will be an opportunity for a new construct and self-understanding of our planetary system, of humanity. And plus, on top of all of this, we know that we're not just all Homo sapiens here. We're Homo sapiens mixed with Denisovans, mixed with Neanderthal. So we're not who we think we are according to religion. And so I see potential for us. I do. I see potential that with near-death experience, this near-death experience phenomena, which started in the 1960s with cardiac care, and as that spread around the world and life-saving resuscitation techniques improved, we've got hundreds of millions of near-death experiencers who are super spiritually oriented in their own cultures, having this conversation where 70% of us use two words, light and love. So I have this hope that by bringing this conversation to the public square, we can maybe nudge humanity into a new way of thinking about ourselves and our relationship to each other. And I know that's utopian, but the tribal nature of humanity has been it was a function of our evolutionary survival, one tribe against another. But when maybe we can realize that we are one tribe when we understand that we're all from this planet.
It's been fascinating to hear some of the stories and to, some of the stories from atheists, for example, because it's easy to kind of think on the surface, well, we're humans, we get judgments before we even dive in. You never judge a book by its cover. That's why that saying exists for a reason, right? So you might think, oh, well, people that have these, well, they believe, and they're just seeing something when they're dying or what. I mean, I could read whole books about this, but then you can watch stories from atheists who didn't have any beliefs before this happened to them, and there's a whole wide variety of people from all walks of life that have had these experiences. And like you said, due to medical technology nowadays, it feels like it's a lot more common because they can actually resuscitate people, whereas in the past it was much more difficult. You mentioned, the whole space, I think, does feel, well, I find the stories compelling, and also it does feel like there's, of course, a greater good from sharing these stories, whether that's finding comfort for somebody who's maybe recently lost a loved one can find comfort in these stories, I believe. A lot of things. But I think that one of the questions that I had are, I want to get your thoughts on some of the universal lessons that you think have come out of your experience that you could share, maybe one or two lessons, and how it's changed you, how you've lived your life since your near-death experiences. And I guess what I'm fishing for is, not anything spiritually or religious based, more like, I use an example, perhaps, is there a detachment to some decisions because it's, of this kind of feeling that there's something greater. So maybe that eases stress, things like that, like sort of everyday life things. Like, what are some of the lessons that you have pulled out that have helped you in your everyday life is, I guess, the question I'm finally getting to. I think by talking, Peter, in case you hadn't noticed.
It's a hard question to ask. It's difficult. I understand what you mean. And the thing that first came to mind is to have no one to push against. So when I'm confronted by a raging person or an angry person or an accusing person, I give them no surface to push against. By falling back inside myself to the temple of my heart, I become like in the end of the Karate Kid movie where the master is being the bad master, the bad sensei is throwing punches at the good sensei, and the good sensei is just turning left shoulder, right shoulder, left shoulder, right shoulder, and not giving the bad sensei a target to hit. And I find that when there is no target to hit, the rage lessens in the other person. They can't get my goat. They can't push my button. And I have a button to push. Okay. So my button, just to be clear, my buttons can be pushed, but
who doesn't?
Yeah, exactly. But I don't have to react in proportion anymore. And that changes my relationship with all sorts of people all the time. So I'm less of my pebble may still drop into the pond because who doesn't have a button, but I won't be dropping a fist-sized rock. And so the ripples that run out from that change the people that I interact with. That's one thing. And a lot of that arises through meditative practice. That's another thing. I find that the meditation empowers my mostly peaceful relationship with the world. I run we have an acre of land and we have a microhabitat here. And so one of the other things that happened way before the ecological movement was moving into microhabitats decades and decades ago, I turned all the lawns of all the parsonages I lived into to microhabitats that the church hated, and that eventually got mowed when I moved out. But now that I have my own acre, I have a microhabitat here. We got a pond and dragonflies and butterflies. And right now, as I sit here, there's a bunch of animals on my doorstep, birds outside, and I live as softly on the land as I can, and encourage other species who have the same light inside of me to live their own lives the way they live it. I don't know if that's practical or not, but it's sure good for those insects and mammals and reptiles and birds that live around me.
Thanks for that. And also appreciate the Karate Kid reference. Love the Karate Kid.
Me too.
I'm going to let you go in a minute here. I want you to share all the places that people can find you. I had one question just about something that we all experience every day, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts. What is the function of dreams?
I think that there are two types of dreams. I spent about a year and a half reading every book I could on brain function, sleep. I was actually trying to study sleep. And in the sleep studies, the prefrontal cortex goes offline, allowing the brain to have access without the repression or the focus or the narrowing of thought. And so many dreams are reflective of our subconscious, what we're experiencing in our lives, emotionally, psychologically, and they can tell us what's going on in our lives. That's one kind of dream. And I think that happens in REM sleep. But I think I know that there are other kinds of dreams because I've had them. The other kind of dreams are the dreams, say, for instance, when I'm flying in my dream and I have a level of awareness that I'm flying in my dream. And because of that level of awareness, I use this technique that I learned about from, I don't know if you know the author Carlos Castaneda, way back when I was an undergrad, to focus on my hands in my dreams and gain some control of myself in my dreams. That's another type. But then there's this last variation. It's a subset. So there's two types. There's the type that comes out of the brain itself, and then there's the type that seems to be leaning in this other direction. I've had dreams where I've been taken out of my body, and I can see my body below, and I'm transported by the same angelic being into a divine presence. It's more like a vision, and a more common form of this, it would be a visitation of the dead in your dream. And so some people, when they have a dead person that they love come to visit them, it happens when they're asleep, and they have a consciousness. And the difference between the two, the one where your brain is talking to itself, and the other is that there's a level of awareness that you're asleep. And you have this experience, this vision, perhaps, of your loved one coming, communicating, "I'm okay. I'm in paradise, and I still love you." That awareness continues on, not just for the next day, which often happens with a regular dream, but for the rest of their life, because it actually changes their grief. So two types, as far as I can tell.
Thanks for that. We should mention the book one more time here. Heaven is Beautiful, How Dying Taught Me That Death is Just the Beginning. Definitely enjoyed it. It was a page turner for sure. Congrats on that. And yeah, if you want to just share where everybody can find you, if they want to get in touch, follow your stuff, all that good stuff.
peterpanagore.love. Panagore, peterpanagore.love. I have a specialty in my counseling, and that is to help people. I did a lot of pastoral counseling over many subjects, but the focus of my work these days is to help people integrate their mystical, spiritual, transformative experiences in a way that can help them understand what happened to them and how to live through it in life now that you've become a different person. And my clientele is global, so I do a lot of that. But also, people just want to have a conversation. That happens too. peterpanagore.love.
I love that. Congratulations. Yeah, I mean, it's people have these experiences, but that's, we're here. So the integration is key, right? How are you going to integrate the lessons, the experience into this next version of who you are after it? And so that's great work. Man, I just so appreciate you taking your valuable time to do a two-parter here with us on the Zero to Travel podcast. Thank you so very much for your time.
Oh, Jason, it's been my pleasure. And one of the reasons it's been a pleasure is because of your brain. The questions that you've asked, the summaries that you give show, a deep caring and capability. So thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for the kind words. I hope we can stay in touch.
I hope so too.
There you have it. Once again, thank you to Peter Panagore, so gracious to give us 2 interviews and so much of his time and so much of his energy and his spirit just to relive and retell this story for you, the listener, here today. So I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you gave you some things to think about. And that's it. We're going to wrap it up with a quote here from Peter's book. I thought this was a lovely quote, and I thought this was a great way to sign off. Quote, "Every act of love accumulates in your soul. No one and nothing can take these from you or destroy them. Love is eternal, and love is inside you." Thanks for listening. Peace and love to you and yours. Cheers.
This podcast has been brought to you by ZeroToTravel.com. Ideas and advice to make your travel dreams a reality.